I'm Autumn Lockett.
And this is Mitch Randall.
And you're listening to Good Faith Weekly.
Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. And on this episode, Autumn and I will catch up, talk about what's going on in the news, from the trial up in Minnesota of Derek Chauvin to the killing of Daunte Wright, to also the situation that was unfolding out in Virginia that we just found out about. Happened all the way back in December, but saw video footage of it this week of another African-American pulled over who happens to be Army Reserve personnel, and he was in uniform. We're also going to talk about the pandemic as well as what's going on more recently in the news. Later on the pod, Autumn and I sat down with Dr. Beth Allison Barr, who's the Associate Professor of History and Associate Dean of the Graduate School at Baylor University. Dr. Barr has a new book out, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and you want to stay tuned for that interview. So stay tuned.
I'm Reverend Starlette Thomas, a womanist in ministry and the host of a new podcast, The Raceless Gospel, from Good Faith Media. We're going to talk about that taboo trinity, race, religion, and politics. Season 1 of The Raceless Gospel has 5 episodes, 5 Sundays, if you will. We're going to take you to church each episode. We're going to talk about the sticks and stones, the skin and bones of Christian discipleship through the structure of a church service. And each episode, we're joined by a special guest who will bring a word. The Raceless Gospel Podcast, 5 episodes, all available March 22nd. I'm your podcast pastor, Reverend Starlette Thomas. Join us as we march into and beyond race, religion, and politics. Learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
Autumn, how are things in your neck of the woods? It's cold in Oklahoma.
It is cold in Oklahoma. You know, April is really hit or miss here. We could be having our wind going in a circle, or it could be, frost on the ground, and it's chilly. I had to dig some of the kids' winter clothes back out of their closet this morning.
That's exactly right. Well, it's been a strange week as far as the news is concerned. I wrote in my article this week, brought up one of my old favorites, Marvin Gaye, and his iconic song, What's Going On, to describe, it seems like we just are in a time warp. I mean, it's been a year since the death of George Floyd. So many people came out and marched across the country demanding justice and policing reform. And it seemed as though the country was in solidarity for the most part, even though certainly there were people who resisted it. But it seemed as though we were heading in the right direction. And here, all of a sudden this week, you got the Chauvin trial going on. You got a situation occurring in Minnesota, just 10 miles away from where the trial is being conducted, where a officer of a police, what was the name of this city? It's Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. Kim Potter pulls her gun and shoots Daunte Wright for a traffic violation. They found out that there was a warrant, but it just all snowballs. And she claims, and she's heard on the video saying taser, 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 but she doesn't pull the taser. She pulls her firearm and discharges it, killing Wright. As one of our colleagues so prophetically said this week, it's always the wrong something. It's the wrong door. It's the wrong person. It's, the wrong gun. At some point you have to ask, is it really? So ingrained in our society that it just, it's just appalling.
We can't let this excuse go by, because then anytime a police officer wants to use deadly force, they'll just yell taser, 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 and then do whatever they want.
Right.
And it's not acceptable. We have to hold their feet to the fire.
Now, Officer Potter was arrested this week and charged with, I believe, 3rd-degree manslaughter, if I'm not mistaken.
That's shocking to me, honestly.
Yeah. It really is. But if that was not enough, Autumn, video footage emerged from a situation that occurred last year in Windsor, Virginia, where U.S. Army Lieutenant Karen Nazario was pulled over. He was the situation began on a dark road after he was leaving drill for the weekend. He was in his fatigues. It was a dark road, you know, really nowhere to pull off that would be safe as far as Lieutenant Nazario thought in his mind. So he drove a mile, low speed, wasn't a high speed at all, a low speed to a lighted parking lot in a gas station, and two of the officers jumped out of their car, one pulling a firearm on him, the other, yelling at him, screaming to comply. You can see the lieutenant's hands out the window, very calmly talking to the officers all the time, and using very, very troubling rhetoric to get him to comply to their orders. And he was honest with them. I'm scared to get out of the car because you may shoot me. I'm frightened. And then they say, well, you should be frightened. And then, of course, they use that terrible line, what's going on? What's going on with you is you're about to ride the lightning, son, which, is a direct reference to the electric chair. And so it's just disheartening. I'm sitting here, it's Thursday afternoon of this week, and we're recording this for Friday Drop, and just sitting here shaking my head because it seems as though we try to take steps forward and then all these situations emerge and here we are again.
Right. And the rhetoric from, the other side is, why are we still talking about this? I'm not racist. And we clearly still have discussions that need to be had because of this. Why are we still talking about it? Because events like this continue to happen. We can't even go, it's like those reports at the factory. There's been 0 days since the last occurrence. 0 days. There have been 0 days since the last, person was killed because of their race.
Mm-hmm. It is, and it's always couched in the context of, okay, well, they should have followed orders, or they shouldn't have, been disobeying the law. Let's think about this for a second. George Floyd lost his life because of a supposedly $20 fake bill. Dante Wright lost his life because of an expired tag, which is now coming to light that the state of Minnesota admits that they are running behind in issuing new tags and new registrations. And so it's just, it's just disheartening. And you think about Breonna Taylor, she was just lying in bed. Nothing than this, Army lieutenant who, and they said it was a tag, that he didn't have visible tags. Well, in the video, you can see the temporary tag. He had just purchased this car, and there's a temporary tag in the back window. He got pulled over because he was a black man. Mm-hmm. Simple as that. And I'm at a loss, and as a Native American in this country, I can't imagine, if I'm exhausted, I can't imagine the frustration and anger and heartbreak and discontent within the African American communities across this country. It's just really, really unsettling.
So we're going to keep talking about it.
That's right. In my article this week, I certainly quote Dr. King, could never be understated. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. But in the shadow of Dr. King's statement, I also quote fellow Baptist and social activist Cornel West, who offered a similar assessment. And he says, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. Here's the reality. America does not love its black citizens. I'm going to say it again. America does not love its black citizens.
Yep.
That is
just look around. It's evidence.
It is. That is an indictment on who we are as a people. And we've got to do better, Autumn. We've got to do better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it starts with seeking justice for those who have lost their lives and who have succumbed to the injustices of our society. But we can do it. I know we can. hopeful a new generation is emerging that's not going to stand for this. Another item in the news this week is that the vaccine rollout hit a snag with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine being paused right now. They're studying it to see if there are potential side effects to that. The most troubling is that it could cause blood clots in women, because I think there's been a number of women. When I say a number, I can't remember the exact number. But six is what comes to mind. 6 women who have died as a result of blood clots coming after they received the injection. So, trying to figure out, were they already prone to blood clots, or did the vaccine actually contribute to the blood clotting?
I think it's important that they're stopping. I think it really, even though, of course, it's frustrating and we want, all hands on deck, all shots in arms, let's get over this thing. I appreciate that they are pausing it, that they are being transparent, because folks who are suspicious of vaccines are using this and saying, like, oh, there's 6 blood clots. Oh, vaccines aren't safe. But here's the thing, they're being transparent. They pause the vaccines. They're studying it. I think they're being very responsible. And I think that, the opposite of that argument is true. The Pfizer's still fine. Moderna's still fine. I think probably Johnson & Johnson will be fine. There are a lot of things that cause way higher percentage of blood clot risk, including having COVID. So,
Yeah.
it's one of those things. Do the benefits outweigh the risk, which is something that you and I have discussed as we've talked to different epidemiologists over the course of COVID.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I'm glad that they are stopping it just to make sure that it is safe. But it does seem as though the other vaccines are going to be able to be rolled out, and there's going to be enough vaccines for every American to have the ability to be vaccinated by the end of July. I know that was a goal of the Biden administration. It seems like they could hit that sooner than later. Of course, the problem is you still have knuckleheads out there who, and a lot of them call themselves Christian knuckleheads, saying that they're not going to take the vaccine. It just blows my mind.
Yeah, I think the last statistic I heard was about 30% of folks who won't get it. And I don't know what to do with that. I have family members who are in that camp, and it's been a point of contention for sure.
Yeah. Well, I just want to encourage everybody. It is safe. They're taking precautions when some troubling data does emerge, but this is a safe vaccine. You can trust it, and it's going to do the job.
Yeah.
And so
Mitch and I are fully vaxxed.
We are.
And we're enjoying our superpowers.
That's exactly right. I'm now part of the X-Men.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then the final tidbit of news that came out this week was that President Biden announced a total withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. And as he made the announcement, the news cycle began, obviously, talking about the longest war that America has ever been a part of. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. The class of 2021. The young men and women who are walking across the stage here in May. We have been at war with Afghanistan for all of their lives. Think about
That's crazy.
Think about that. Your sons, your granddaughters, your nieces, your nephews. When you go to that graduation in May, or you watch it virtually, safe at home, when you see that graduate, just know they have never known a country not at war.
Yeah.
Well, we had a delightful conversation this week with Dr. Beth Allison Barr, whose new book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth, is fascinating. And so I'm excited for you to hear this. And Autumn and we had this great conversation with Dr. Barr, and it's a great book. So stay tuned.
Discovering Wholeness is a new podcast from Good Faith Media for healing trauma, for unearthing self.
because trauma is so pervasive in our communities, it comes into our spiritual spaces, our churches. And I'm wondering
Yes.
how trauma is expressed in religious communities.
My experience of sitting in the pain, the shame, and the terror at times with some of the people that I have sat with that have experienced that judgment, but to the degree of those kinds of really strong words like abomination and you're going to hell. And it's so heart-wrenching.
I'm Kendall Rothis, an author, feminist theologian, ordained minister, and spiritual director. Join me and my colleagues, Kendra Frazier and Jillian Drader, as we gather each week to discuss trauma and spirituality, to stay grounded as we heal ourselves and walk alongside those who are healing. Join us and learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly, and on this episode, we've got a very special guest with us, Dr. Beth Allison Barr. Dr. Barr is an associate professor of history and associate dean of the graduate school at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, where she specializes in medieval history, women's history, and church history. She is the president of the Conference on Faith and History and is a member of Christians for Biblical Equality. Barr has written for Christianity Today, The Washington Post, and Religion News Service. And she is a regular contributor to the Anxious Bench, the popular Patheos website on Christian history. Dr. Barr's new book is The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. And the book will be available for purchase or download on April the 20th. Dr. Barr, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right, so we've got to get this out of the way. I mean, it's hanging there in the air, and we just got to get it out of the way. Congratulations to the Baylor Bears men's basketball team for winning the national championship. Those of us live in Norman, Oklahoma, we kind of get used to national championships, every 10 years or so, but we understand it's a big thing in Waco right now.
You're poking the bear there.
Literally, right?
Literally. Yeah.
Well, I can imagine the excitement on campus right now. Everything.
So, yeah, well, we're faculty and residents, and so we live with undergrads, and I don't think they slept last night. So, we could hear them for a very, very long time.
I bet.
The Dr. Pepper floats were flowing, huh?
They were flowing. Yes. We won't talk about what else might have been flowing, but nonetheless, they were exuberant and excited, and
it was so exciting.
Had a great time.
I was watching my Facebook and Twitter feeds last night, and all my Baylor colleagues, man, they were just so ecstatic.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'm happy for them, and good thing for the university.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it was fun.
So speaking of basketball, there was an incident that came up during the NCAA men's and women's tournaments. The women players revealed the difference between the men and women's weight rooms. The men were given, state of the art, fancy schmancy, and then the women got, 2 gallons of milk on the end of a stick. So was that moment just a microcosm of the inequality that we see in society today?
Oh, totally. I mean, you can even... Yes, I mean, it clearly is that when we think about who's important and who we're going to fund, it clearly is more, the men's programs are still the ones that are more well funded. I mean, you could even think, and I don't want to say anything disparaging at all, because we are so excited about the men's national, basketball win last night, but at the same time, the women at Baylor have won this a lot,
right?
And so, right. We have a very successful. So, I mean, it's. I think the difference in the locker rooms clearly shows that we are not past that. Even in our very, very modern society, that there's still significant inequality between women and men.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think, Dr. Barr, your book is so important for us right now, because some of the inequalities that we see in society that, Autumn just mentioned with her question, I think there is a direct correlation between how the church has looked at gender inequality and have propagated this doctrine of manhood and womanhood and what that
Hmm.
means for centuries upon centuries. And so I'm really excited that this book is coming out. So tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah. So the making of biblical womanhood is not really something I ever intended to write. It is something that it was really born, I guess, in 2016.
Hmm.
When there was a combination of factors, and one was my husband getting fired over the triggering issue was women in ministry was asking for a woman to be able to teach Sunday school, and that was the same semester as when Donald Trump got elected.
Hmm.
And even though I've grown up all my life in more conservative Baptist circles,
Hmm.
even within those more conservative Baptist circles, the women who had been following Trump and had seen the way that Trump responded to women and the way that Trump treated women, it was very traumatic to realize that the people that we went to church with elected him
Right.
president. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
that was a very traumatic experience. I still don't think people grasp how traumatic that was for ordinary women in the church, for many ordinary women in the church. And so that combined with my husband being fired from a
Mhm.
place that we had been at for a long time and had a very good ministry over such a trivial issue, it seems, and certainly not a gospel issue, and also something that's not based in anything biblical despite the claims. It was a moment where everything changed for me. And the book actually starts in the moment that everything changed for me, where I realized I had to do something that I knew where biblical womanhood came from. And through my historical training, through my
Mhm.
understanding of the Bible, I knew that it wasn't biblical. And I realized that most of the people around me had no idea. Because of what we've been taught in Sunday school, what we have been taught in our church history curriculum, what we've been taught in seminary, none of that addresses these questions of women's history scholarship, and even the broad understanding of Paul, the historical understanding of Paul. I mean, these are conversations that are absent in modern evangelical churches, and so people just don't know. So I began to write. If you go and look at my history on the Anxious Bench, and I left up all of my original posts. The book was born in several of my posts on the Anxious Bench, and I left them up because I wanted people to see the evolution of my thought. And you can see me beginning to speak out. I started first with a series on on rethinking Paul, and that led to a series on disrupting Christian patriarchy.
Mm.
And it was at that point that I had gotten a lot of attention for these posts, that I got contacted by an editor who asked me if I had thought about writing a book.
Mm.
And so, really, this book was not my end goal. My end goal was helping people know that what the church thinks is biblical womanhood is not actually biblical.
Right.
So if that helps a little bit.
No, absolutely. Helps out a great deal. I can remember I went to Southwestern Seminary many years ago, and I arrived on campus there in Fort Worth, a good little fundamentalist and patriarch in all of my thinking. And I can remember sitting there listening to Dr. Boo Heflin, who was an Old Testament professor, and I've written about this at goodfaithmedia.org. Listen to him begin to deconstruct everything that I had been taught about
Mhm.
the inequality of gender roles.
Yeah.
And he did it using the Bible, which just blew my mind. It was like, wow, there's a lot more in this Bible that I have not been told about, and how to look at certain text in a new and fresh way, or really a traditional way that is more productive and more insightful than what I have been taught growing up. So that's what, just the title itself, this making of
Right.
biblical womanhood, I think is important, because one of the frustrating points for me, assuming it would be for you as well, is when you get into these debates about equality and inequality. A lot of times, more conservative voices, more conservative theologians say, well, your argument is not with me, it's with the Bible. That's
Exactly.
not true whatsoever.
Exactly. It defaults to this idea that biblical womanhood is built upon a biblical idea.
Mhm.
And that is sort of that's a conversation stopper for people, because they're like, well, I'm sorry, this is the way God created it. And so you just got to live with it. And if you fight against it, then you're fighting against God.
Mhm.
And that narrative is just not true. And in fact, the making of biblical womanhood, part of the reason we settled on that title was to show from the get-go that biblical womanhood is something constructed by people. It is not something made, it's not something or divinely ordained in the stars. It is something that people have created. So
Yeah, absolutely. And then your subtitle is very provocative for me, how the subjugation of women became gospel truth. Because just a moment ago, one of your answers, you said, this issue, seems to be apart from gospel. I'd argue that it's wrapped inside of gospel, but it's not the gospel truth. And
Right.
so my question is, how did the subjugation of women get tied into what you define as gospel truth?
Yeah, that's actually a very modern development if we think about biblical womanhood and we think about the history of women in the church. And so, one of the things that modern Christians have a hard time with is that what they remember about church history, what they know about church history, is that women mostly haven't been priests and preachers and teachers, not to the same degree that men have. And so they look at that and they say, oh, this is the way that it's always been. This is the way that it's always supposed to be. And so it makes them, without critically examining that, it makes them, think, well, this is the way that it's supposed to be now. And so what happened at the end of the 20th century is when that understanding, that sort of understanding that most Christians had, that patriarchy or that the subordination of women is a part of the Christian tradition, is part of Christianity, when it began to be tied to the gospel message, they were like, well, of course, because this is the way God ordained it. I mean, it was sort of, people didn't question it. But what happened, and I think this is because the history that we often don't know, is that there were a lot of preaching women and a lot of teaching women, even in the 20th century. And it is interesting to me that at the time where we see women beginning to make more strides in leadership in the church, is that the time that we also begin to see this subjugation of women being tied with the gospel. And for those of you who don't know that or don't think, just go read Tim Keller, who ties it into the gospel. Go read Owen Strachan, I never can say his name, who relatively recently has said that complementarianism, which is biblical womanhood, is a gospel issue.
Right.
Tim Keller, I think, is the one who said that people who don't accept women's subordinate role within the church, that they have a weaker understanding of the Bible and the gospel. And then, of course, Russell Moore, in that somewhat infamous article he wrote in 2006, in which he said that we've got to make complementarianism, biblical womanhood, more enforced within the church. And so we need to create a vision of it that ties it directly into the gospel. And so what we see is these major, these significant, I don't know if I put Owen Strachan in that, but he's part of this sort of milieu.
Yeah.
But we see these significant voices in American Christianity proclaiming that these distinctive gender roles that put leadership in men's court and subordination in women's are connected to a proper understanding of the Bible and have become gospel truth. And specifically in the book, I connect that to the rise of inerrancy, which is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, as well as the reincarnation of an old heresy, which is just amazing that it has come back into the church again. So,
Yeah, when you hear the words enforced,
yeah.
it takes me back to my Margaret Atwood days, reading Handmaid's Tale. Oh,
Oh, I know.
it's
Well, and
terrifying to me.
people don't like, we don't like to hear that language. But if we think about what's happened in churches and
Mhm.
how these things have been enforced,
Mhm.
people who resist it get pushed out of the churches. I mean, that's what happened to us.
Mhm.
They get pushed out, and so I mean that's enforcement.
Yeah.
Mhm. Do you think the reason we don't hear about as many women, priests and ambassadors during Bible times is because they were too busy also like doing the mom thing? And we didn't have breast pumps back then,
Yeah.
and so we had to like actually be getting the work done while also like carrying scripture around, and the men had time to write about themselves as men are wont to do.
Well, I part of it is, and this is, I think, I'm not the first person to say this, but the history of the world is patriarchal,
Of course
and
it is.
so most of the people who got the education were still far and were men. The people who had the ability to control the narrative. And so, actually, what's really shocking is how many women get into this narrative. And so, I mean, in Christianity, so many women get into this narrative. And so, that's actually something that's pretty, shocking about it. If we think about women in the early church, women who became some significant players in the early church who did get written about, most of those women were women who either left their roles as wives and mothers or never partook in those roles as wives and mothers, because the church didn't emphasize that as the only pathway for women. I think today, women, to be godly women, were expected to be wives and mothers. But in the early church, that wasn't the case. The women who were considered to be more dedicated to God were the ones who actually forsook those roles, which I talk about a few of them in my book. I mean, you can think about Paula, St. Paula, who I talk about, who helped write the Vulgate with Jerome. And she actually abandoned her children, I mean, and went off to go live, they were fine.
Right.
But she did. She left one of them crying on the beach and went off to go join Jerome in what she was called to do, and ended up being one of the translators of the Bible into Latin. So,
wow.
So that's a little bit. So, I think I do think part of it is that the way narratives are constructed, they're mostly constructed by men and for men, and so they leave women out of the histories. But at the same time, women always kind of find their way in, regardless of their very many roles. And I think that's one of the amazing things about the history of Christianity is how God, I mean, women don't get left out. We keep trying to leave them out, but they actually don't.
Dr.
So-
Barr, can you trace back a moment in history, church history, biblical history, where patriarchalism just basically took over the narrative? Because here you have Jesus, and in his narrative and his story, he's doing everything he can to lift up women, to demonstrate this theology of equality and giving women a place to learn at his feet, empowering them to teach and to preach. And I mean, just time and time again, we see this with Jesus. And then he leaves the scene. Now, he rose from the grave. Don't save your emails. Rose from the grave. But he leaves the scene, and then all of a sudden, you've got Paul, you've got the rest of the apostles. The first century church begins to develop. But then 200-300 years, you've got Constantine, and the full force of the patriarch is in place.
So, I can pinpoint several times, because in women's history, this is something that women's historians have identified for a lot. There's patterns in women's access to authority, and we often see it coming sort of in at times where there is less structure and less clearly defined roles, we find women moving into more leadership positions that are officially recognized. And then as structures get more established and as roles get more clearly defined, we see women being written out of those leadership structures. So take, for example, in the early church, yes, there is a flourishing of women because of the example of Jesus. I would also say because of Paul. I mean, Paul has a lot of women working with them.
I
know
think
you're
Paul
with me
gets
on
a
that.
bad rap.
He does. I think so too. And he gives Romans to Phoebe, and he does all of these sorts of things. And then what we see, though, as Christianity then becomes the institutionalized religion of the state, is when we see women beginning to be pushed out. Now, they have a lot of places to go. They go out, we see these desert mothers who are just as significant as the desert fathers. They just get left out of the historical narrative. Especially if we look at the history of Eastern Orthodoxy, the Eastern part of the church, women are much more prominently displayed. We also see, I have a grad student who works on medieval Africa, and she's found some fascinating things about women there in the Ethiopian church. And so, but as structures become more enforced and more regulated, is when we begin seeing women written out. So as we see the position of bishop becoming established, and we see the sort of this idea of apostolic authority being clearly in place, where it gets passed down through what becomes ordination, we begin to see women being pushed, out. They're not recognized within that male lineage. And so we start seeing them get pushed out. And we have some examples of women like Bridget of Kildare, who's a great example in the early, who accidentally gets ordained, according to the stories about her. And they're like, well, that's fine. She's the only one, and she gets to continue on. Yeah, it is. It's sort of a whoops. But nonetheless, the reason that she's allowed to continue on is because there is a history of women like her doing those same sorts of things. Yeah. So I think the reason women get written out is because men begin to control who gets let in. And so, women really have continued to do the same things. We just don't call it official leadership roles. Women have always preached. Women have always taught. It's just that they don't get recognized with the same authority and status of men. And so that's, Is that helpful?
Well, I'm a man. It doesn't help me a whole lot being a man. But
well, no. Talking about the narrative of women getting pushed out. So
it's very fascinating. Absolutely.
So,
and it's it's so frustrating to be reminded that the patriarch has been so strong for so long. But there are cracks.
Yeah, there are cracks, and in fact, the conservative resurgence of the 1970s is because of a crack in the 20th century, where we start seeing women moving into ministerial roles, and then we see a crackdown on them.
Absolutely.
So there is a renewed interest in this conversation within the church and society, prompted most recently by Beth Moore's public departure from the SEC. And churches with more conservative theology are now sort of reevaluating their conclusions. Some of them are.
Some of them.
Do you think this might be one of those hinge moments in history?
I am optimistic that it might be. Now, as a historian, we are very skeptical, hesitant to predict the future. But based upon past patterns, this clearly does seem to be a moment of reckoning, as some has called it. And the church has realized what people have been saying for a very long time, is that this authoritarian structure that excludes women from leadership roles and doesn't allow women to exercise often very little authority and leadership in the church, puts women in very vulnerable positions. That leads to church too, and these explosion of sex scandals and so forth. There's a correlation between these very authoritarian structures and women being left in these more vulnerable positions. So I think the church has begun to realize this. I think also the election of Donald Trump really woke up a lot of people. I mean, that's clearly, I mean, Beth Moore, that's when she has that famous tweet where she said, "Wake up, sleepers," when she suddenly realized that people were really contemplating voting for Donald Trump. And she was like, "Wake up, sleepers, what is going on?" So I think the church is waking up. I also think that, and this is something in the past, one of the problems that women have had in the past is that even though we have known the problems, we haven't had a platform to get that information out there. And the internet world has changed that. And so if you go back, to the late 90s and the early 2000s, you begin to see women beginning to circumvent. I mean, Rachel Held Evans, Lifeway wouldn't publish her book, but people still read her blog.
Yep.
And, she, just because they stopped publishing her didn't mean that she wasn't still getting her message out there. And so women have found a way to circumvent it. And in fact, you can't and then you have, people like me, like Beth Moore too. Beth Moore leaving the SBC also means that she's in the Baptist tradition, which has a long history of supporting women in ministry. And so she can't, what can they do to her to stop her?
Right.
They don't control her publications. They don't control her voice anymore. The same sort of thing with me is we're in a Baptist tradition. We choose to be in a Baptist, to support women in ministry. I'm at a university that is very broad. I have tenure. I mean, seriously,
Sure. Yeah.
there's not much that can be. So I think women's voices are no longer being silenced the way that they used to be silenced.
Let's talk about that platform for a moment, because this is
Yeah.
fascinating to me, because I think you're right. There
Yeah.
are more opportunities for female voices, whether that is theologians, historians,
Mhm.
professors, pastors.
Yep.
There's just more avenues for them to vocalize their message and what God's put on their heart.
Mhm.
At the same time, let's go back to the local church,
Yeah.
because there was a study released by Baptist Women in Ministry. Oh my
Mhm.
goodness, probably about 5-6 years ago now, that demonstrated the really insignificant advances women have made in the pulpit. It seems as though
Yes.
there are a lot of churches, a lot of individuals who give a lot of lip service to equality and women in ministry, but opportunities have not just been,
Yeah.
there haven't been a lot of opportunities for them. But at the same time, I do see those opportunities increasing more recently. And we talk about things like Beth Moore and
Mhm.
your book coming out, and other examples that we see of strong female leadership. It just gives me hope. But when I go back to the local church, I'm
Yes.
still a little bit discouraged, because it seems as though the church hasn't been able to break free from that finally, to say yes to women in the pulpit.
No, I totally agree with that. I was on a meeting, I can't remember, a few years ago, where I heard the numbers of empty pulpits in Baptist churches in Texas.
Hmm.
Um, and most of those churches, there are plenty of women to fill those pulpits, female pastors, but those churches won't bring them. And so, I mean, it would solve our empty pulpits in the Baptist world if churches would bring women in to serve. And so there's a disconnect. And in fact, I'm in, you mentioned I'm in the conference on faith and history, and I've been president a year longer than I meant to because of COVID. So we had to delay. So hopefully not for, I mean, it's a great organization, but I'm ready
Sure.
to not be in
Right,
charge.
sure.
But one of the conversations we started having years ago, and this was between Kristen Kobes Dumais, who of course is the author of Jesus and John Wayne now, but she
Mhm.
was also she writes with me on the Anxious Bench, and then Chris Geertz, who is also writes on the Anxious Bench, and I always mispronounce his last name, even though I've known him for a very long time, but he'll forgive me. But we had a panel a few years ago, and it was on the disconnect between what Christian scholars know and what Christians in the church know. And that this creates, so no matter what advances that we sort of make and understandings that we sort of make and progress in many areas, there's a great disconnect between then how we get that to churches. And I think a big piece of that is seminaries. When the conservative resurgent took over, that was why they did it. I mean, what they did was in some ways brilliant, because they knew that in order to change the culture of churches, they had to control what pastors were taught. And so they moved in and they took over the seminaries. And what we have right now is the churches are now run by these pastors who graduated from these seminaries that were controlled by the conservative resurgence. And it's had a significant impact on the culture of our churches. It takes years to change a culture in churches. And so I think that's discouraging. I can think about in Waco, and I've done this before, and I don't want to call out, other churches in Waco, but I've counted how many, we have Truett in Waco, Truett, which fully supports women in ministry. But yet most of our women who graduate from Truett don't get hired by Waco churches. Most Waco churches don't have women in preaching or even pastoral positions. And so it is, but I think it's that disconnect. So,
what can we do? I mean, we can talk about it, and it gets quite depressing. You look at the history, but like I said, there are moments of hope. You've mentioned those moments of hope historically, but today, right now, what can we do to try to right this ship, to be advocates for genuine equality and gender justice in this world of ours? What can we do to help advocate for this cause?
I feel like there's some kind of medieval device that would help.
That would fix everything, because the medieval church was so not patriarchal.
I've been to some museums in Germany that tell me there's some devices that might help some of
there's two things that I think that help change culture. And one of them is experience. And I think a big problem, and I keep trying to get my husband to write a book with me on this, because we were in youth ministry for so long. And one of the things that we noticed was that most of the kids in our youth group had never gone to other types of churches. They were so, if I can use the word, inbred. They had never been to an Anglican service or to a Catholic service. And when I say Anglican, I mean like in the UK where I go. They had never been to, they'd never been to a Black church and seen that. And so their experiences are so narrow, and they'd never seen women teaching or preaching. It seems to me if we could just get people to see women, especially women who are in almost every other way parallel to those faith traditions. One of the problems with women is that there's so few churches that take us that oftentimes we have to leave behind the churches that we might prefer to be in, and move to other traditions or ones that are more progressive, perhaps, simply because there's no other place to go. And so what that does is that then it makes these churches that already are resistance to women in ministry lose all of their called women. And we no longer have women in these places who really do have callings to preach, teach, and lead. So it seems to me we've got to somehow change these experiences. We've got to introduce our youth and our people within the pews to how God uses both women and men in biblically faithful ways. I think the other key part to it is, and of course I'm an educator, so I'm always going to say education.
Oh, absolutely.
But we've got to change what people are learning in churches. We've got to take away the stranglehold. I mean, in the Baptist circles, Lifeway has a stranglehold on the curriculum in churches. I've grown up in the Baptist church. I haven't always been in the Baptist church, but when I've been, currently we are back in the Baptist church, but as where we've been, they've always used Lifeway Sunday school material. And I have to tell you that I will never teach I have not ever taught from it. I always change it. I'll do whatever because I've never been happy with how it portrays church history as well as the understanding of the Bible. So we've got to change this curriculum that people are being taught, and that's really one of the reasons I wrote The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and the reason I wrote it in the way I did was to try to break down some of this disconnect between academia and people in the pews,
Sure.
to try to help them see that there's another way.
I love that. I mean, providing examples and education, I think you're absolutely 100% right. On the education front, we're doing our part, nurturing faith
You are.
curriculum. We have curriculum out there written by Dr. Tony Cartledge that advocates for equality on all levels. So
Yes.
those of you who are suffering under the oppression of Lifeway, just give us a try. We would love to entertain
I'm
that.
so glad you said that. And I don't mean, I know a lot of people who work at, it's, I hate to call
Oh, they're
out
good
names
people. They're good people.
and but it's just, it's had a significant impact.
Sure, absolutely.
And it
when,
matters.
when we've dealt with several people who've been published by Lifeway, who've worked at Lifeway, and one of the things that was really disheartening to me was when I heard the fact when you are published from Lifeway, they own that material.
Yep.
From here until Jesus comes back.
Yep.
So if you ever change your mind on it or want to tweak something, you can't without their permission. They own it. So
Yeah, no, that's actually, and people don't realize that.
yeah.
So,
Right. Well, good. Well, I like that. Provide examples. I can never forget when my kids growing up, and I pastored for 20 years, they saw women preachers all the time, women leaders, deacons, and when they would spend the night with a friend on a Saturday night and go to some of the more conservative churches here in Oklahoma, they would come back with their eyes wide open saying, "You're not
Yes.
going to believe what we experienced this morning." And
Yes.
they said, we
Yeah.
so love our church. I was like, great. Oh, it's good to hear.
Yeah, no, and the opposite happens too when you have kids who are in more conservative churches and they go and they hear the gospel message being preached faithfully from the mouth of a woman from a pulpit. It makes an impact, which is
Yes.
why conservatives are often so afraid to let people hear women.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. Before we let you go, though, Autumn is going to ask you our final question that we ask all of our guests.
So our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of everything that we've talked about and your upcoming book, what is your more to tell?
Gosh, you asked me that at the beginning and now I completely forgot. So I hadn't thought about it. But there is so much more to tell. I think maybe the thing that I would want, what I want maybe women and men to hear is that the Making of Biblical Womanhood only tips the scale of it's just a tiny bit of what the church doesn't know. And for all of my years of being, growing up in the Southern Baptist Church and going to a secular public university in a women's studies program that would probably curl a lot of people's hair, who would not approve of it. I have to tell you that I have never seen anything that has made me lose my faith in the gospel of Jesus. And what I have seen has only strengthened the need for us to break down barriers that keep people from hearing the gospel of Jesus. And so maybe my something more is that my goal is to get the gospel freed from these things that weigh it down. I mean, I'm trying not to quote Paul, but indeed,
So hard.
it's so hard not to quote Paul, but indeed, we have been so trapped. The gospel has been so trapped by us, the very people who are supposed to be bringing it to the world. And so I just really would like people to think about how their church had, what else they can do to help free the gospel so we can really be people of the gospel and do what God has called us to do. So I don't know, that may have been more serious
love
than
it.
what you wanted. There's so much
No.
more I could tell you too.
I'm just glad you didn't mention the Bears winning the national championship. So I
I thought about it. I thought I could have reverted to living on a college campus, and I make Star Wars waffles. By the way,
I
that's
love
something
that.
else. I have about 15 waffle makers, most of them Star Wars related. And so I make
fantastic.
undergraduates hundreds and hundreds of waffles. So it's a lot of fun.
I love it. Well, Dr. Beth Allison Barr, thank you so much for being a guest with us at Good Faith Weekly. The new book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth, arrives at bookstores and online April 20th. So make certain that you go ahead and buy it already. Put it
Pre-order.
Yeah, pre-order. That's right. So thank you. It was a delight to have you today. Great talking to you, or with you.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Good Faith Weekly once again. And as always, we'll return next week with another guest. Until then, keep living good faith.
Lot Carey is proud to bring you conversations with some of the best and brightest pastors coast to coast. Our new podcast, Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving, delivers wisdom from the Black church for the whole church. Find us wherever you get your podcast or listen online at lotcarey.org. That's LOTTCAREY.org. We look forward to the pilgrimage with you.